Close your eyes for a moment and picture Bruges. Not the modern postcard Bruges full of chocolate shops and tourists with selfie sticks. I mean Bruges in the late Middle Ages. The air smells like fresh bread, a little bit of fish, and maybe a touch too much manure. The cobbled streets are packed with stalls, people bargaining over cloth, spices, and shiny trinkets. Bells ring from church towers, and everywhere you turn, someone is selling something. Now, where there's money and goods, there are also thieves. That's as true today as it was 600 years ago. The medieval market was basically the perfect place for a criminal to blend in. Crowds pressed together, strangers brushing shoulders, purses hanging loosely at belts. If you were a thief, Bruges was your playground. Most of the thieves weren't masterminds or charming rogues. Forget the Hollywood idea of clever outlaws with secret lairs. Many were just poor folks desperate for food or a coin or two. A good loaf of bread could be worth the risk. Some thieves specialized in snatching bread straight from a stall. Others went for small luxuries, a strip of silk, a shiny knife, or a pouch of foreign spices. Picture a young man weaving through the market, pretending to admire the chickens for sale, while his hand quietly slips into a distracted merchant's pocket. Quick, silent, and gone before anyone noticed. Except, of course, people did notice. Merchants in Bruges were no fools. Many tied bells to their coin pouches, so a little jingle might betray a thief's hand. Others used apprentices to watch the crowds like hawks. When a thief was caught, punishment was rarely gentle. Stocks in the town square were the usual fate. Imagine sitting there, head and hands locked in wood, while the whole town walked by. Kids throwing rotten vegetables at you, old ladies muttering about your shame. It wasn't exactly a five-star experience. For repeat offenders, things could get worse. Sometimes thieves were flogged, branded, or even banished. Bruges depended on its markets, so keeping them safe was serious business. A single stolen pouch of coins might be forgiven once, but the city didn't want to become known as a place where merchants got robbed. Trade was the bloodline of Bruges, and thieves were a threat to that bloodline. Still, some people admired the cleverness of certain thieves. One story from the Bruges records tells of a man who trained his small dog to snatch purses. The little dog would dart under cloaks and bite the strings, then scurry back to its master. A four-legged pickpocket. You almost have to respect the creativity, even if it ended with both man and dog in trouble. Markets were also places where different types of crime overlapped. Pickpockets rubbed shoulders with counterfeiters, and sometimes traveling merchants cheated customers by mixing bad goods with good ones. A bag of flour might be bulked out with chalk. A barrel of wine might be watered down. Technically, that was fraud, not theft. But in the eyes of the customers, it felt just the same. Now, imagine walking slowly through the market with a pouch of coins on your belt. The chatter around you grows louder, someone bumps into your shoulder, you look down, and suddenly, your pouch is lighter. The thief? Already gone. Swallowed by the sea of bodies. That was the skill of the Bruges market thief. Not brute force, just timing, speed, and disappearing into the crowd. The irony is many of these thieves probably spent their stolen coins right back in the same market. A loaf of bread, a mug of ale, maybe even a small trinket to impress someone. Their lives were short cycles of stealing, eating, and running from the law. But let's be honest, sometimes the stories sound almost funny. One thief in Bruges was caught stealing fish, but he didn't get far. The smell gave him away. He tried to hide the fish under his cloak, but the stench of herring followed him like a guilty cloud. When the guards caught him, he claimed the fish had simply jumped into his arms. Points for imagination, at least. Humor aside, life for these criminals wasn't easy. Most were at the bottom of society, scraping by day to day. Poverty was common, and hunger pushed people into risky choices. Stealing bread might sound petty to us now, but in the Middle Ages, a loaf could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Bruges itself made the situation complicated. It was one of Europe's busiest trading cities, full of wealth and opportunity, but also sharp divides between rich and poor. Merchants flaunted fine clothes, while laborers struggled for scraps. Temptation was everywhere. If you were a hungry worker watching fat geese being carried past, the line between honest living and crime blurred very quickly. Of course, medieval law didn't care much about motives. Hunger or not, a thief was a thief. The law wanted order, not excuses. And so, Bruges became a stage where thousands of small crimes played out, most forgotten except for the rare times they were written down in court records. And that's what makes these criminals so fascinating. They weren't kings, knights, or legendary villains. They were ordinary people who slipped into the shadows of history. A stolen loaf of bread here, a missing coin purse there. Hardly the stuff of epic tales. Yet, their tiny acts of rebellion tell us something real about medieval life. When we think of crime in history, we often imagine dramatic battles, notorious outlaws, or bloody betrayals. But the truth is quieter. It's in the crowded market of Bruges, where a hand brushes too close to a purse. It's in the desperate look of someone eyeing a loaf of bread. It's in the scolding voice of a merchant crying, "Thief," as the chase begins. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, picture yourself in that medieval market. Hear the clatter of carts, the chatter of merchants, the rustle of cloaks in the crowd. Somewhere nearby, a thief makes their move. Perhaps you notice them, or perhaps you don't. But either way, the story ends the same. Another small crime, another forgotten criminal, another whisper from the past. And tomorrow, the market will open again. The merchants will set out their goods, the crowds will gather, and in the busy streets of Bruges, the thieves will return, as they always did. If Bruges was famous for its bustling markets, Bologna in medieval Italy was famous for something a little stranger. Not its pasta, though yes, even back then the food was good, but for being one of Europe's great university towns. Students came from all over Europe to study law, philosophy, and especially medicine. And medicine in the Middle Ages had a, let's say, complicated relationship with the human body. Doctors wanted to understand how people worked on the inside, but there was a problem. The church frowned on cutting open human bodies, at least most of the time. Which meant that for young students eager to learn, there was only one way to get practice. They needed corpses. Now, corpses didn't exactly line up for volunteering. So, in the shadows of Bologna, a new kind of criminal trade appeared. Grave robbing.
Most grave robbers weren't ghoulish villains twirling mustaches. They were practical types, often hired by someone else. Students, doctors, or curious scholars would quietly pay them to find a body. Sometimes it was fresh, sometimes not so fresh. The fresher, the better for anatomy lessons. Of course, grave robbing wasn't exactly a respected career choice. Families mourned their dead deeply, and disturbing graves was seen as a crime against both people and God. So when a robber was caught, punishments could be harsh. Heavy fines, imprisonment, even public humiliation. But the demand kept the business alive. Bologna's university was famous, and famous universities attract eager students, and eager students attract people willing to do the dirty work to help them. Let's pause for a moment and think about the logistics. Grave robbing sounds like a dramatic adventure, but really it was mostly exhausting. Digging a hole 6 feet deep with medieval tools, that's no small task. And they had to do it quietly, in the dark, without lanterns drawing attention. By the time they actually reached the coffin, the robbers were sweaty, sore, and probably questioning their life choices. And then there was the smell. I won't linger on this since you might be listening while trying to sleep, but let's just say that old graves weren't exactly fragrant. Picture a robber lifting a lid, taking one whiff and muttering something like, "They don't pay me enough for this." Sometimes, instead of whole bodies, thieves went for smaller prizes, rings, jewelry, or even shrouds. Yes, shroud stealing was a thing. Cloth was valuable, and grave goods often fetched a good price at market. That meant that grave robbers weren't always working for science, sometimes they were just after quick cash. One old Bologna record even complains that graveyards had to be watched by guards not to protect the living, but to protect the dead. Imagine being assigned the midnight shift, standing around in the dark, making sure nobody dug up Aunt Maria. Not exactly the glamorous life of a medieval watchman. And yet this shady trade had an odd role in pushing medical knowledge forward. Some of the very doctors who later wrote respected texts likely learned their craft thanks to stolen bodies. Grave robbers became, in a twisted way, part of the history of science. Without them, anatomy lessons would have been little more than imagination and guesswork. Still, society didn't exactly celebrate them. Grave robbers were whispered about, feared, and despised. No one wanted to admit they used their services, but everyone knew someone who did. It was a dirty secret, hiding in the shadows of one of Europe's brightest intellectual cities. There's a strange balance here, isn't there? By day, Bologna was full of knowledge, debate, and learning. By night, it was full of shadows, shovels, and crime. Progress often walked hand in hand with rule-breaking. And of course there were mistakes. A robber might pick the wrong grave, angering a powerful family, or they might be caught carrying a suspiciously heavy sack down a quiet alley. You can imagine the awkward conversations. Guard: "What's in the bag?" Robber: Turnips?" Guard: "Turnips don't usually smell like that." Let's be honest, grave robbing was a dangerous gamble, not just from the law, but from superstition. Many people believed that disturbing the dead could invite curses or restless spirits. Even the robbers themselves, as tough as they tried to be, probably whispered a quick prayer before lifting a body, just in case. Over time, Bologna scholars managed to secure official permissions for occasional dissections, usually using the bodies of executed criminals. But before that system, the grave robbers filled the gap. They weren't heroes, they weren't villains in capes either. They were just ordinary criminals, driven by money, opportunity, and maybe a little pressure from desperate students. And like the market thieves of Bruges, they've mostly been forgotten. Their names don't appear in grand chronicles. No statues were built to them. Their stories only survive in scattered records, dusty notes in city archives, and the occasional angry complaint about missing grave clothes. So as you drift deeper into rest, imagine the quiet graveyards outside Bologna's walls. Moonlight falls on crooked stones. Somewhere, a shovel scrapes softly in the night. Two tired men work quickly, glancing over their shoulders. They don't know that centuries later, their small, grim crimes will still be remembered, not for who they were, but for the strange role they played in history. Another forgotten criminal story. Another whisper from the medieval world. And tomorrow, Bologna will wake again. Students will fill the lecture halls, and graveyards will remain eerily silent, at least until the next midnight visitor. If you've ever been inside a great cathedral, you know the feeling. High stone arches reaching up towards the heavens, stained glass windows glowing with color, and the sound of footsteps echoing on cold stone floors. York Minster in medieval England was one of those places, a symbol of faith, power, and beauty. But here's the thing about cathedrals. They needed light. And in the Middle Ages, light meant candles. Lots and lots of candles. Tall beeswax tapers for the altars, chunky ones for side chapels, and smaller ones for everyday use. And candles weren't cheap. They were basically the luxury batteries of their day. Which is why one night, someone decided to risk it all for candles. It sounds silly at first, doesn't it? Who would risk punishment just to steal wax? But in medieval times, wax was valuable. Beeswax especially. It burned clean and bright, much better than smoky tallow candles made from animal fat. Churches needed enormous supplies for daily services, feast days, vigils, and all the little rituals in between. which meant that if you could sneak a few candles out of a cathedral, you had something worth real money, or at least enough to barter for food, drink, or a decent pair of shoes. So picture it, York, late at night. The city streets are quiet, the bells of the minster have fallen silent, and the moon casts pale light over the rooftops. Somewhere in the shadows, a figure creeps towards the cathedral doors. He's not here to pray. He's here for a little wax-based burglary. Inside, the minster is vast and silent. Maybe the thief lights a tiny stub of a candle to see, or maybe he just feels his way in the dark. He knows where the candles are stored, tall cupboards or chests in the sacristy, stacked nightly for use. He pries one open, and there they are, long gleaming tapers, waiting to be lit on holy days. Now, sneaking out with a bundle of candles doesn't exactly make you look innocent. Imagine trying to pass a city watchman while carrying an armful of giant wax sticks. Oh, they're for my personal prayer meeting. Not the most convincing excuse. Still, people tried. There are records of candle thefts at York Minster and other great churches, and they show how something as simple as wax could tempt desperate hands. A thief might sell them quietly in markets, or melt them down to make smaller candles that were easier to disguise.
It wasn't exactly the perfect crime. Punishments, of course, were no joke. Stealing from the church was seen as not just a crime, but a sin. You aren't just taking property, you were offending God. That could mean harsher penalties, fines, public humiliation, or even excommunication. And excommunication in the Middle Ages was serious. It meant you were cut off from the sacraments, from the community, even from burial in consecrated ground. All for a bundle of wax. Yet we can almost sympathize. Imagine being poor, cold, and hungry. A candle wasn't just light, it was warmth, safety, comfort. In a world where night was truly dark, a single flame mattered. We flip a switch today without thinking, but back then, light came from careful labor, keeping bees, harvesting wax, shaping each candle by hand. Every flame was precious. And in York, the Grand Minster burned hundreds at a time. To a poor man watching from the street, it must have felt like luxury beyond imagination. Bright, warm, endless light. Surely no one would notice if a few went missing. But of course people did notice. Cathedral officials kept strict accounts. Every candle was tallied, every expense noted. If even a few were gone, someone would be in trouble. There's even a quiet irony in this crime. Candles in the minster were meant to symbolize the light of Christ. But to a thief, they were just valuable sticks of wax. Sacred meaning on one side, survival on the other. Same object, two very different views. Stories tell us that sometimes guards actually caught thieves in the act, sneaking out with their waxy loot. You can almost imagine the scene. Guard: "What's in your cloak?" Thief: "Dripping wax onto the floor." "Nothing?" Guard: "Uh-huh. Looks like you've got a bit of light traveling with you." Not exactly the stealthiest operation. And yet, these candle thieves remind us of something important about medieval crime. It wasn't always grand or violent. Sometimes it was small, almost petty, but rooted in real need. Nobody stole candles because they dreamed of being a legendary outlaw. They stole them because light mattered, because wax was worth money, and because the cathedral had more than enough to tempt wandering hands. For most of these criminals, their names are gone. We don't know who they were or what happened to them after. They appear in a record here or there, a faint note of disapproval, then vanish back into obscurity. But for a brief moment, their crime flickered like the candles they stole, bright enough to be noticed, then snuffed out. So as you settle deeper into rest, picture the quiet halls of York Minster. Candles flicker on tall stone altars, their flames swaying gently in the draught. Somewhere in the shadows, a thief's hand reaches out, tempted by the glow. For him, it isn't light from heaven, it's a chance for survival, a chance for warmth, maybe even a small profit. And when morning comes, the bells will ring again. The candles will be replaced. The great cathedral will shine as if nothing happened. Another small crime, another forgotten thief, another whisper in the long history of the Middle Ages. Travel in medieval Europe wasn't easy. Roads were rough, wagons broke down, and if you were lucky, the worst you had to deal with was mud up to your ankles. But if you were unlucky, you met the highway bandits. The Rhine River Valley, stretching through what is now Germany, was one of the busiest trade routes of the Middle Ages. Merchants hauled wine, salt, wool, and spices up and down the river. Pilgrims walked dusty paths toward shrines. Messengers carried important letters sealed with wax. And all of them had one thing in common: they were juicy targets. Bandits loved the Rhine. Dense forests, hidden valleys, and winding roads made perfect hiding spots. A bandit could sit behind a rock all day, waiting for the right traveler to pass by. One minute you're trotting along on horseback, humming a tune. The next, 3 men jump out of the bushes yelling, "Hand over your purse!" Now, before we imagine these guys as glamorous Robin Hood types, let's be clear. Most bandits weren't noble outlaws giving to the poor. They were hungry men, former soldiers, runaway peasants, or just people who figured stealing was easier than farming. Some were desperate. Others were downright mean. Picture a small group setting up an ambush. One bandit blocks the path with a fallen log. Another hides with a bow, ready to scare the unlucky traveler. A third steps out dramatically, probably trying his best to look intimidating. If the victim was a poor pilgrim, they might get away with losing only a few coins. But a rich merchant? That was a jackpot. Merchants knew the risks. Many traveled in groups, almost like medieval caravans. Picture a long line of wagons, creaking wheels, oxen pulling heavy loads, guards trudging along with spears. Safety in numbers. Still, the bandits were persistent. If they couldn't grab the goods on the road, they might sneak into riverside warehouses at night, cutting open sacks of grain or rolling barrels of wine into the dark. And yes, some bandits had boats. Imagine drifting quietly down the Rhine in the moonlight, rowing silently towards an anchored merchant barge. It sounds almost peaceful, until you remember that these weren't friendly fishermen. They were river thieves, and the only thing they wanted was what you were carrying. Punishments for banditry were harsh. Local lords had no patience for criminals who disrupted trade. Trade meant taxes, and taxes meant money. A captured bandit could face the gallows, a hanging tree by the roadside to serve as a warning. Some were even broken on the wheel, a brutal punishment designed to scare others away from crime. But despite the danger, the Rhine bandits never truly disappeared. For every one caught, another seemed to pop up. Life in the Middle Ages was unpredictable. War, famine, and poverty pushed people into desperate choices. If farming failed or if you were tossed out by your lord, the road might start looking like a source of quick income. Some bandits even gained a strange kind of reputation. Tales spread of leaders who were clever or bold, almost like folk heroes. One story tells of a robber who would bow politely after stealing, as if good manners somehow balanced out the theft. Another supposedly left little receipts, scribbled notes saying, "Thanks for your contribution." Of course, it's hard to know if these tales are true or just the medieval version of gossip. Travelers, for their part, often tried to avoid bandit trouble with creative methods. Some wore plain clothes to hide their wealth. Others disguised themselves as poor pilgrims. And then there were the merchants who hired armed escorts. Nothing says "don't mess with me" like a couple of burly guards carrying crossbows. Still, danger never fully disappeared. The Rhine was too tempting, too full of opportunity. Imagine standing on a hilltop, looking down at the wide river glistening in the sun, barges drifting lazily along. To a bandit, that sight wasn't beauty. It was a buffet. And yet, just like the candle thieves and grave robbers, most of these criminals were forgotten. Their names didn't go into history books.
The records we have are usually brief. 2 men caught robbing travelers, punished by hanging. That's it. No details, no backstory, just a line or two in an old ledger.
It makes you wonder what kind of people they really were. Did they joke nervously before an ambush? Did they argue about who got the biggest share of the loot? Did they sometimes feel guilty? Or did they sleep soundly under the stars, full of stolen wine? One thing is certain, the Rhine was never completely safe. Even as trade flourished, the shadow of banditry lingered. Merchants grumbled, guards kept their eyes sharp, and travelers whispered prayers as they passed through forests. So, as you drift into sleep, picture that medieval road. The trees press close on either side, the sound of hooves clops gently on the dirt. A merchant hums to himself, thinking about the warm bed waiting in the next town. And just beyond the bend, in the quiet shadows, a bandit shifts his weight, waiting for the right moment. Another forgotten story, another nameless criminal, fading into the background of history. And when dawn breaks, the road will be busy again, wagons creaking and pilgrims walking, as if the night before never happened. When we think of Florence in the Middle Ages, we usually imagine grand art, wealthy merchants, and the sparkle of the Renaissance just beginning to shine. But alongside the painters and bankers, Florence had another kind of artist, one whose canvas was a little round, shiny, and illegal: the counterfeiters. Money was the beating heart of Florence. The city was famous for its gold florin, a coin so trusted that it spread across Europe as a kind of international standard. Merchants loved it, bankers loved it, kings loved it. Which meant, of course, that counterfeiters loved it too. Now, counterfeiting wasn't just a casual crime. It was serious business. To medieval governments, messing with coins was basically messing with the entire system. Think about it. A single fake florin could spread like a rumor, passed from hand to hand until nobody was sure which coins were real anymore. And in a city built on banking, that was a nightmare. But desperation breeds creativity. Somewhere in a quiet back alley, a man might set up a small workshop. The tools weren't glamorous, maybe a mold, a hammer, some scrap metal. He'd melt down cheaper metals like copper or tin, pour them into coin-shaped molds, and then coat them with a thin layer of silver or gold. From a distance, they looked real enough. In a dark tavern, maybe no one would notice. Some counterfeiters got fancy, carving false stamps to mimic the official city seal. Imagine the patience it took, squinting in the candlelight, trying to copy every little detail of a lion or a lily. One slip, and the coin looked suspicious. But if you got it right, you could slip it into circulation and hope it disappeared into the stream of trade. The funny thing is, people often spotted counterfeits not by looking, but by weighing them. Merchants kept little scales in their stalls, ready to test a coin's true value. If it felt light or rang dull when tapped on wood, suspicion rose. There must have been a lot of awkward exchanges. Merchant: "This florin feels funny." Customer, sweating nervously: "Oh, that's just a special edition." Of course, if you were caught with fake coins, the punishment was brutal. Counterfeiting was seen as treason against the city itself. Some counterfeiters were burned alive, others had their hands cut off, and some were even boiled in oil. Florence wanted to make absolutely sure nobody thought making fake money was a clever idea. Still, the counterfeiters kept coming. Why? Because the rewards were tempting. A handful of fake coins could buy food, clothes, or even rent for a small room. For the poor, it was a shortcut out of hunger. For the greedy, it was just another way to grab more wealth. And Florence wasn't alone. Counterfeiting was a medieval problem across Europe. Every big trading city had its share of forgers, but Florence, with its world-famous coinage, drew more than most. It was like painting a target on your back saying, "Hey, make fake versions of me." What's fascinating is how seriously the Florentines took this. They built entire systems to protect their money. Official mints were carefully guarded, workers were sworn to secrecy, and inspectors checked coins constantly. Even so, counterfeiters slipped through the cracks. You can almost imagine a sly craftsman smirking as one of his fakes made it into the bustling marketplace. There are even records of traveling counterfeiters, moving from city to city like wandering artists of deception. They'd set up shop for a while, flood the market with bad coins, then vanish before anyone caught on. A kind of medieval hit and run. Sometimes, though, the counterfeiters got bold. One tale tells of a man who mixed real gold with just enough cheaper metal to stretch it further. He wasn't making fake coins, he was making weak ones. To him, it was genius. Same shine, more profit. To the authorities, it was still a crime. And here's the ironic part. Florence itself, like many medieval states, occasionally adjusted its coins in times of need. Kings and city leaders sometimes reduced the silver content in money to stretch their treasuries, which means that when counterfeiters did something similar, the line between criminal and official was a little blurry. The difference was simple. One group had the power to call it policy, and the other just got punished. If we pause for a moment, it's easy to see why counterfeiting stories still matter. They show us the fragile trust at the heart of medieval life. People needed to believe in their coins, just like we believe in our paper money or bank accounts today. When that trust cracked, chaos followed. But at the same time, the image of a tired craftsman in a dark workshop carefully hammering out fake florins feels strangely human. He wasn't a monster. He was someone taking a risk, playing a dangerous game with metal and fire, hoping to fool the world for just a little while. Most of these counterfeiters, like the market thieves and the grave robbers, are gone from memory. Their names are buried in dusty court records, if they appear at all, but their handiwork lives on. Archaeologists still find fake coins in the soil, centuries later. Imagine digging in a field and pulling up a florin that once made someone's heart race with fear or pride. So, as you settle deeper into rest, picture Florence at dusk. The narrow streets glow with lanterns. Merchants close their stalls, jingling pouches heavy with coins. And somewhere in a cramped little room, a man hunches over his work, hammer tapping softly, metal cooling in a mold. He smiles to himself, convinced his latest creation will pass unnoticed. Tomorrow, his coin will buy bread, maybe wine, maybe just a few hours of relief. But for tonight, it's just him, his tools, and the flicker of candlelight on false gold. Another quiet crime, another forgotten face, and another whisper in the long history of medieval life.
And that's what made the silent poisoners so feared. Naples was a city of politics, family rivalries, and ambitious nobles. And where there's ambition, there's usually a little bit of danger. If someone stood in your way, whether for power, money, or even romance, one option was to argue, another was to duel, and the third, well, was to pay a poisoner. Now, don't imagine some cloaked figure slipping through the night like in a spy movie. Medieval poisoners were often apothecaries, people who mixed herbs, medicines, and potions. They already had the knowledge and the tools. Most of their work was harmless, even helpful. They brewed remedies for fevers, stomach aches, or headaches. But with the right mix of plants, they could create something deadly. Wolfsbane, hemlock, belladonna. These plants weren't strangers to the Mediterranean countryside. In small doses, they could dull pain. In larger doses, well, they could end it permanently. And if you disguised the taste with honey, wine, or spices, the victim would never know until it was too late. Rumors of poison were everywhere in Naples. A duke dies suddenly? Must have been poisoned. A merchant collapses at dinner? Poison. A noblewoman falls ill after a feast? You guessed it, poison. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was just gossip. But the fear was real. People became suspicious of their meals, their servants, even their closest friends. The silent poisoners thrived in that fear. They weren't always hired killers. Sometimes they were desperate wives, unhappy with their husbands. Sometimes they were rivals in trade. And sometimes they were nobles themselves, clever enough to mask their intentions behind a smile and a toast. Of course, the authorities hated poisoners. Unlike a sword fight, poison was sneaky, hard to prove, and impossible to guard against completely. You could post guards at your door, wear armor in the streets, but how do you defend against a few drops slipped into your wine? That's why punishments for poisoners were harsh. In Naples, as in other cities, being caught meant torture, execution, or both. But here's the tricky part. Catching them was hard. How do you prove someone poisoned a man when all you have is a jug of wine and a corpse? Medieval forensics wasn't exactly advanced. There were no lab tests, no microscopes. Judges relied on witness testimony, confessions, and sometimes just superstition. One suspected poisoner might be dragged before a court and accused simply because someone claimed they saw her buy herbs at the market. Another might be accused because he brewed medicine that tasted bitter. And confessions? They were often pulled out under torture. So the line between guilty and unlucky was thin. Still, stories of clever poisoners filtered through the centuries. One tale tells of a noblewoman who supposedly kept a ring with a hidden compartment. She'd dip the ring into a drink, twist it, and release a tiny amount of poison. It sounds almost too theatrical, like something out of a play, but it shows how fascinated and terrified people were by the idea of poison. Another rumor claimed that wealthy families sometimes kept little poison books filled with recipes written in code. Whether those books truly existed or not, they added to the aura of mystery. Poison wasn't just a tool, it was a legend. Now, before we judge too harshly, let's remember the world these people lived in. Life was unstable, politics brutal, and justice uncertain. For many, poison was simply another weapon, no different than a dagger or an army. It was the poor man's sword, the woman's shield, the ambitious noble's shortcut. And yet, it's also worth noting the quiet humanity in this story. Imagine the apothecary, hunched over his table, mixing herbs for medicine. His goal might be healing, not harm. But one request from a desperate customer could shift everything. Do you refuse, knowing you might anger someone powerful? Or do you agree, hoping no one ever traces it back to you? It was a dangerous crossroads, and some chose the darker path. Centuries later, archaeologists and historians still wonder how many deaths in Naples were natural and how many were poisoned. Some graves show no clues at all. Others might reveal traces of certain plants. But most of the time, the silent poisoners remain invisible, their work vanishing like a drop of ink in water. So tonight, as you drift off, picture a feast in medieval Naples. Long tables groan under roasted meats, bowls of fruit, loaves of bread, and pitchers of wine. Laughter fills the hall, and candles flicker against the stone walls. Guests raise their cups in toasts, smiling at one another. And somewhere, in the middle of all that joy, a hand lingers just a little bit longer over a goblet. A whisper of powder slips in, unnoticed. The cup is lifted, the sip is taken, and life changes forever. No clashing swords, no roaring battles, just silence, sweetness, and a secret. When we think of monks, we usually imagine calm, mind men in brown robes, chanting in stone chapels, living peaceful lives of prayer. And sure, that was often true, but in medieval Normandy, not every monk was thrilled about the monastic lifestyle. Some of them ran away. Now, that might not sound like a crime. After all, today, if you don't like your job, you quit. But in the Middle Ages, being a monk wasn't just a career, It was a lifelong commitment. When you entered a monastery, you took vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. Once you were in, you were supposed to stay in. Walking away wasn't quitting. It was breaking a sacred contract with God and the church. And that made you a criminal in the eyes of the world. So why did monks run away? Well, let's be honest, monastic life wasn't exactly easy. A typical day meant waking up before dawn, chanting prayers, working in the fields, studying scripture, and following a strict set of rules. No wives, no drinking binges, no personal freedom. For some men, it was a noble path. For others, it was suffocating. Imagine being a young man sent to the monastery by your family, maybe because you were the second or third son and they didn't want to split up the inheritance. You didn't choose this life. It was chosen for you. And after a few years of cabbage stew, endless prayers, and cold stone walls, the thought of escape might start to sound pretty good. The runaway monks of Normandy didn't usually slip out in dramatic midnight chases. Some left quietly, sneaking through the gates. Others just walked away during errands in nearby villages. Once outside, they faced a big question. What now? A runaway monk couldn't exactly blend in easily. He had the haircut, the famous tonsure, that shaved circle on the top of his head, and he probably didn't own much beyond his robe and sandals. So the first order of business was often finding new clothes. Otherwise, anyone spotting him could cry out, "That's a monk on the run!" And if he was caught, punishment was harsh. The church saw runaway monks as rebels against God. Some were whipped, others were locked in tiny cells as penance, and some were forced back into the monastery under watch, their freedom gone forever. But even despite the risks, monks still ran. Some joined wandering groups of soldiers or mercenaries. Others tried to live as regular peasants, blending into the countryside.
And a few, probably the clever ones, used their education to find work as scribes or teachers. After all, monks knew how to read and write, which made them more skilled than most people at the time. The church hated this trend. Councils were held to discuss the problem of fugitive monks. Letters went out ordering villages to return any runaway monks to their monasteries. But the harder the church cracked down, the more monks seemed to slip away. And here's a funny thought. In some records, runaway monks are lumped in with thieves and outlaws. Imagine a parchment listing crimes in Normandy: banditry, horse stealing, counterfeiting, and Brother Gerard ran away again. Not exactly the same level of danger, but still considered a crime. One story tells of monks who ran away not because they hated monastery life, but because they craved adventure. They wanted to see the world, travel, and experience life beyond the cloister. To them, the walls of the abbey felt like a prison. Out there was freedom, music, markets, and maybe even love. Of course, not every runaway monk made it far. Some were caught within days, recognized by locals. Others gave themselves away by their speech or their habits. Picture a man trying to live as a farmer but constantly quoting scripture while planting turnips, not exactly blending in. Still, the runaway monks remind us of something very human. Even in the Middle Ages, even under vows of obedience, people longed for freedom. They longed for choice. And sometimes, they were willing to risk everything just to breathe outside monastery walls. If we step back for a moment, it's easy to see why these stories survived. They reveal the tension between the strict order of the church and the restless spirit of ordinary men. The church wanted stability, control, and lifelong devotion. But the human heart doesn't always follow rules. And maybe, in a quiet way, the runaway monks helped shape history. Their defiance showed that even sacred vows couldn't completely cage a person's will. Some of them vanished into the wider world, their stories lost to time. Others were dragged back, punished, and remembered only as cautionary tales.
So tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, picture a monastery in Normandy. The bells have rung, the monks gather in the chapel, chanting softly in the flickering candlelight. But one robe hangs empty. Out in the darkness, a lone figure slips down a dirt road, the cold night air sharp on his face. He doesn't know what tomorrow will bring, freedom, danger, or capture. But for this moment, he is free. And that, perhaps, was worth everything. When you think of bandits in the Middle Ages, maybe you imagine scruffy men hiding in forests, waiting to ambush travelers. But Spain had something different, something a little unexpected. Women who led lives of crime and became known, at least in whispers, as bandit queens. Now, don't go imagining tiaras and fancy thrones. These queens didn't sit in castles, they ruled the roads. In the hills and valleys of medieval Spain, trade routes crisscrossed the land, carrying goods from one city to another. Merchants hauled spices, cloth, wine, and coins, and where there were goods, there were thieves. But what shocked many travelers was finding themselves face to face not with a bearded outlaw, but with a woman giving the orders. Why would women turn to banditry? Well, medieval Spain wasn't an easy place for women without strong family ties. If you were widowed, abandoned, or simply poor, options were few: the convent, marriage, or begging. But some women chose another path, grabbing a sword, gathering a small crew, and taking to the hills. Dangerous? Absolutely. But it gave them power they never would have had otherwise. One story tells of a woman who disguised herself as a man to join a band of thieves. Eventually, her true identity came out, but instead of casting her aside, the group followed her lead. She was clever, bold, and ruthless enough to earn respect. Soon, she was running the show. Her targets weren't just random peasants either. She aimed for rich merchants, travelers with fat purses, and occasionally unlucky nobles. Another tale speaks of a widow who turned to banditry after her husband's death left her with nothing. Instead of slipping into poverty, she chose the road. She supposedly carried daggers under her cloak and demanded tribute from passing caravans. In some versions, she even gave a share of the loot to poor villagers, turning her into a kind of Spanish Robin Hood figure, at least in local legends. Of course, these women weren't exactly celebrated by the authorities. Being a bandit was a crime, no matter who you were. But the very fact that stories of them survived all tells us something. They stood out. In a world where women were expected to stay quiet and obedient, these bandit queens shattered the mold, and that made them both fascinating and terrifying. Now, don't imagine that they lived glamorous lives. Being an outlaw meant living rough in the mountains, sleeping under the stars or in caves, always ready to run. Food was stolen or begged for. Danger lurked at every corner, from rival bandits to soldiers sent to hunt them down. But for some women, that wild freedom was worth more than safety. It's easy to picture them, a figure in a worn cloak, standing on a rocky path, hand resting on a sword hilt, demanding payment from nervous merchants. Behind her, a few loyal followers shift uneasily, eyes on the horizon for approaching guards. It wasn't royalty, but it was command. What's especially striking is how these women entered folklore. Centuries later, ballads and stories still whispered about them. Were the tales exaggerated? Probably. Did they become larger-than-life figures, more legend than fact? Almost certainly. But somewhere behind the songs and stories were real women who dared to step outside the roles society had carved for them. Punishments for captured bandits, male or female, were brutal. Hanging, beheading, or worse. For a woman, the added scandal of her crime sometimes meant even harsher judgment. To the authorities, she wasn't just a thief, she was an insult to the natural order. And yet, that didn't stop others from following the same path. maybe that's the most human part of all. Faced with poverty and oppression, some women looked at the risks and still chose rebellion. In the dusty roads of Spain, where the sun beat hot and the hills offered hiding places, they carved out brief, fierce lives as queens of the wild. If we look closely, their stories echo even today. They remind us that history isn't just kings and knights. It's also the forgotten rebels who lived on the edges, defying the rules. These bandit queens may not have written books or founded dynasties, but they left behind something just as powerful: the memory of women who refused to be silent. So as you drift off, imagine Spain's rugged hills at dusk. The sky glows red, the wind rustles the olive trees, and along a lonely road, a merchant urges his mule forward nervously. From the shadows, a figure steps out, cloak billowing, eyes steady. A soft voice cuts through the quiet. "Hand it over." The merchant sighs, knowing resistance is useless. Coins change hands, the bandits melt back into the hills, and the night closes in once more. Somewhere in the darkness, laughter echoes, free, wild, and fleeting. The bandit queens ruled no kingdoms, but for a moment in time, they ruled themselves. And that was enough. Medicine in the Middle Ages was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly modern science.
People didn't have microscopes, they didn't know about germs, and they definitely didn't have antibiotics. What they did have were herbs, prayers, and a lot of hope. And sometimes, when hope ran out, healers drifted into some very shady practices. In medieval towns and villages, healers were often the first people you called when something went wrong. If you had a fever, a broken arm, or a mysterious rash, the healer showed up with a pouch of dried plants, a jar of ointment, maybe even a few charms. They weren't trained doctors in the way we think of today. Instead, their knowledge came from experience, old traditions, and whatever scraps of books they could find. Now, most of these healers truly wanted to help. They used mint for stomach aches, garlic for infections, and honey for wounds. Some of their remedies actually worked. But without real medical understanding, trial and error often led to strange and sometimes dangerous treatments. Imagine being sick in medieval Europe. The healer might show up and say, your humors are unbalanced. The theory of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was the big medical idea back then. If you had too much of one humor, it caused illness. At least, that's what they believed. The solution? Get rid of some, which is why bloodletting was so popular. Nothing says healing like someone showing up with a knife and a bowl. But beyond the standard stuff, there were the more adventurous healers. The ones who promised miraculous cures, whispered secret recipes, or carried mysterious powders in hidden jars. For desperate families, it was tempting. If your child was sick or your crops failed, you might turn to anyone who claimed they had an answer, even if that answer involved ground-up animal bones or a suspicious-looking potion. And here's where things blurred between medicine and crime. Some healers, especially in places like Normandy and Naples, were accused of being frauds, taking money for treatments that didn't work, or worse, making people sicker. A healer might sell you a potion that was supposed to cure fevers, but really just knocked you out with too much alcohol. Another might promise to lift a curse, but secretly slip poison into the mix. Then there were the wandering healers, traveling from village to village, selling cures out of little bags. Some were genuine, others were closer to con artists. They could vanish before anyone realized their miracle cure hadn't worked. Imagine buying an expensive potion, drinking it, and discovering it was just colored water. Not a good day. And yet, people kept trusting them. Why? Because they had no better options. The real doctors, often tied to universities or serving nobles, were expensive and rare. Ordinary villagers couldn't afford that, so they'd turn to the local healer, even if the cure was risky. Sometimes these healers gained reputations, some good, some terrifying. A woman who knew her herbs might be respected in one town, but in another, she might be called a witch. If her cures worked, she was praised. If someone died under her care, suspicion fell fast. Whispers of sorcery, curses, and devil's work spread quickly. The church wasn't thrilled about these independent healers either. Official medicine was supposed to be guided by faith and tradition. Anyone mixing herbs in secret or muttering strange chants looked suspicious. That's how some healers ended up in court records, accused of witchcraft or poisoning, when really they were just experimenting. But let's not forget the hopeless side of this story. People in the Middle Ages were desperate for help. Diseases swept through villages, injuries from work or war went untreated, and life expectancy was short. When the healer promised relief, people clung to it like a lifeline. Even if it was false hope, it was better than nothing. In a way, these shady healers weren't just criminals, they were reflections of the times. They stepped into a gap that real medicine couldn't fill. And while some took advantage, others probably did their best with what little knowledge they had. Picture it. A sick child lies in a dim cottage, fever burning. The parents hover, terrified. The healer arrives, pulling out a pouch of herbs. She sprinkles something into hot water, murmurs words of comfort, and hands over the steaming cup. Will it work? Maybe. Maybe not. But in that moment, the family believes. And belief can be powerful. Even when the cure was nothing more than honey and hope, it gave people strength to carry on. Of course, not all healers were innocent. Some were outright criminals. There are records of healers who poisoned rivals, sold fake charms for profit, or secretly worked as hired killers disguised as apothecaries. It's a reminder that trust is a fragile thing, and in desperate times, sometimes people put their trust in the wrong hands. But here's the part that lingers. Among the frauds and failures, a few remedies really did help. Garlic truly fought infection. Honey did soothe wounds. Willow bark used for pain contained the same ingredient that would later lead to aspirin. So in between the nonsense and the fraud, the seeds of real medicine were quietly growing. As you drift off to sleep, imagine medieval Normandy or Naples again. The streets are dark, the houses small and smoky. Inside, a family sits by the fire waiting. The healer knocks, enters, and lays out small bundles of herbs. The smell of rosemary and garlic fills the air. Outside, the night is cold. Inside, for just a moment, there is hope. Not every healer was a saint. Not every cure worked. But for the hopeless, even the promise of healing was worth believing in.
Maybe he distracts a guard. Maybe he slips something small into his sleeve. Later that night, he sneaks away into the dark streets, clutching a bone or a vial like its treasure. Of course, the church saw relic theft as not just a crime, but a sin of the highest order. Stealing from God? That was practically asking for lightning to strike. Punishments for captured thieves were harsh. Floggings, mutilations, even death. But that didn't stop them, because the rewards were too tempting, and the faith of ordinary people made relics more precious than gold. Sometimes relic thieves were shockingly bold. There are tales of entire reliquaries vanishing in the night, carried away on carts. In one story, thieves broke into a church, stole the relics, and fled across the countryside. When they were caught, the relics were triumphantly paraded back, as if the saints themselves had intervened. But here's the ironic part. Not all relics were genuine to begin with. Medieval Europe had far more holy nails than could have possibly been used in one crucifixion, and more saintly bones than there were saints to go around. Some relics were outright fakes, which means some relic thieves may have risked their lives stealing chicken bones, dressed up as holy remains. Imagine that, dying for a fraud. Still, the devotion surrounding relics was real. Pilgrims believed in their power to heal, to bless, to protect. To them, the relic wasn't just an object, it was a bridge to the divine, and that made the theft feel like an attack on their faith itself. The relic thieves of Canterbury, and of Europe in general, show us a fascinating side of medieval life. Faith and crime were tangled together, devotion and desperation walking hand in hand. Relics inspired awe, but they also inspired greed. And maybe that's the part that makes the story so human. For every pilgrim who came with hope in their heart, there was someone else eyeing the same relic with thoughts of profit. The cathedral was both a house of God and, in the eyes of some, a glittering target. As you drift deeper into sleep, picture Canterbury once more. Pilgrims shuffle in, candles glow, chants echo softly against the stone, and somewhere in the crowd, a pair of watchful eyes linger too long on a jeweled box. The prayers rise to heaven, but down on earth, another plan is taking shape. The relics may have promised salvation, but for the thieves, they promised something far more earthly: wealth, power, and a chance, just maybe, to escape the hopeless grind of medieval life. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, few figures were as familiar as the friar. Unlike monks who stayed tucked away in monasteries, friars were meant to be out in the world. They walked the streets, preached in towns, begged for alms, and reminded people to live good Christian lives. In theory, they owned nothing and depended entirely on the kindness of others. Think of them like wandering influencers of the 13th century, except instead of likes and followers, they collected bread, coins, and prayers. But of course, where there's trust, there's room for abuse. And some friars, it turns out, were not exactly saints in sandals. Some were liars, cheats, and smooth talkers. They used their position, their robes, and their carefully practiced piety not for the salvation of souls, but for a free meal, a pouch of coins, or maybe even a few favors on the side. It's not that every friar was crooked. Many really did live lives of poverty and service. But the bad apples stood out, and medieval people noticed. The very image of a friar, round-faced, friendly, maybe a little too friendly, became a source of jokes, suspicion, and even resentment. And some friars became outright criminals, turning the art of begging into a racket. So what did these so-called holy men get up to? Well, let's start with the basics. Begging friars were supposed to rely on charity, but a dishonest friar might exaggerate his needs or flat-out lie. "Good lady," he might say, "your donation will go to feed starving orphans." In reality, it went to buy himself some good ale. Or, "Kind sir, I need a roof over my head tonight." And by roof, he meant a soft bed in a generous widow's house. Some friars went further. They told tall tales of visions, miracles, or special indulgences they could offer. For a price. "Give me a coin," they'd promise, "and your sins will be lighter." Now, the official church frowned on this, but the practice of selling indulgences in one form or another was widespread. A clever friar could pocket a small fortune, one copper coin at a time. And then there were the wandering storytellers. These friars were experts at spinning yarns to loosen a purse string. They knew how to make an audience laugh, cry, or tremble with fear. They could describe hell so vividly you'd want to pay them immediately, just in case it kept you out of the flames. You could almost think of them as medieval stand-up comedians, except the punchline always involved handing over your money. One of the best windows we have into how people felt about these shady friars comes from literature. Geoffrey Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, pokes fun at a character simply called the Friar. He's a smooth talker, good with the ladies, and not above bending the rules to get what he wants. He's charming, yes, but also a bit of a con man. Chaucer wasn't just making this up. He was reflecting the reputation friars had earned in the real world. But back to the criminals.
Some friars weren't content to just trick people with words. They dabbled in forgery, carrying around fake letters that supposedly came from bishops or even the Pope himself. "See here," they'd say, waving a seal, "this document proves I'm entitled to collect funds for a holy cause." Of course, the only holy cause was their own pocket. Others became outright thieves. Imagine inviting a friar into your home, giving him supper, offering him a bed. The next morning, he's gone, and so is your silver spoon. Because who would suspect a man of God? Well, after a few such cases, plenty of people did.
The church tried to keep control, of course. There were official orders of friars: Franciscans, Dominicans, Carmelites, Augustinians, each with rules and oversight. But the sheer number of wandering friars made it hard to police them all, and many of the dishonest ones traveled constantly, moving on before suspicions could catch up with them. For ordinary people, this created a strange mix of feelings. On the one hand, friars could be kind, comforting, and genuinely helpful. On the other hand, you never quite knew if the one knocking at your door was there to bless you or fleece you. A cynical villager might mutter, "Lock up the chickens, here comes a friar." It's worth pausing to remember that medieval folks weren't gullible fools. They joked about these dishonest friars all the time. Plays, songs, and stories often mocked them as greedy or lustful. Everyone knew the type: the friar who preached poverty while secretly enjoying life's comforts. And yet, people still gave, partly out of faith, partly out of fear, and maybe partly because friars were simply very convincing. So, were these lying friars criminals in the eyes of the law? Sometimes, yes. Fraud, forgery, and theft could all land a friar in serious trouble. But often, the worst punishment they faced was being exposed, laughed at, or moved along by suspicious villagers. After all, who wanted the embarrassment of hauling a man of God into court? It was easier to just shut the door and tell your neighbors about it later. Still, over time, enough bad behavior added up. The image of the dishonest friar became a symbol of wider corruption in the church. By the later Middle Ages, critics of church authority pointed to these very figures as proof that reform was needed. In a way, the small crimes of these wandering tricksters fed into the bigger story of change that eventually reshaped Europe. But tonight, let's not think about all that history just yet. Let's picture a sleepy medieval village, lanterns flickering in the windows, the smell of wood smoke drifting in the cool evening air. Down the lane comes a figure in a brown robe, humming softly, a bag slung over his shoulder. He knocks on a door, smiles warmly, and says, "Peace be upon this house." The family inside hesitates, glances at each other, and then slowly opens the door. Is this a holy man come to share wisdom and blessings, or is it one of the lying friars, ready with a smooth story and an eager hand? In the soft candlelight, it's hard to tell, and maybe that's exactly how he liked it. Medieval London was a noisy, crowded place. Imagine narrow streets packed with stalls, animals wandering freely, merchants shouting prices, and the smell of roasting meat mixing with the less pleasant odors of everyday city life. Now, take all of that, multiply it by 10, and you've got a London fair. These fairs were some of the biggest events of the year. People came to trade, gossip, dance, eat, and of course, spend money. And wherever there's money, there are always people trying to make sure it ends up in their own pockets. Literally. Enter the pickpockets. London's fairs were paradise for these sneaky criminals. The crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, everyone distracted by jugglers, singers, and merchants showing off exotic goods. A good thief could slip through the masses like a fish in water, and nobody noticed until much later when someone reached for their purse and found nothing but air. What did these pickpockets actually steal? The most obvious target was the coin purse. In medieval times, coins were kept in small leather bags, often tied to a belt or tucked under clothing. That meant the thief needed quick fingers and a steady hand. A tiny tug, a careful snip of the strings, and poof, the purse was gone. The victim wouldn't notice until hours later, probably when they were ready to buy a meat pie. But purses weren't the only prize. Fairs also sold cloth, spices, jewelry, and trinkets. A skilled pickpocket might swipe a small bundle, or even lift an item right off a stall when the merchant's head was turned. Cloaks and coats with hidden folds made great hiding spots for stolen goods. It's no wonder some people went to the fair with less than they could afford to lose. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Pickpocketing wasn't always a lone wolf activity. Some thieves worked in groups, each with a role. One distracted the victim, maybe by bumping into them or spilling a drink. Another slipped the purse away. A third melted into the crowd with the loot. If the victim shouted, only the clumsy bumper was caught, while the others vanished. Honestly, if they hadn't been criminals, they could have made a great theater troupe. Of course, medieval authorities didn't take kindly to this kind of behavior. Punishments could be harsh: stocks, whipping, branding, or worse, depending on the crime and who was robbed. But catching a pickpocket in a sea of thousands was nearly impossible, and so, for many, the fairs remained a hunting ground. Let's pause for a moment and picture one of these fairs. Bright banners flutter in the wind, children running around clutching sticky sweets, merchants showing off bolts of cloth so fine they shimmer. A traveling minstrel strums a lute, while a bear on a chain growls at a curious crowd. It's loud, chaotic, full of life. And just at the edge of the bustle, a wiry figure in a brown cloak moves quietly, eyes scanning for opportunity. He spots his target, a plump merchant laughing at a joke, his coin purse dangling carelessly from his belt. The thief steps closer, bumping into another passerby with a muttered apology. A quick flick of the knife, a careful tug, and the purse is free. In seconds, it disappears into the folds of his cloak. The merchant is still laughing, completely unaware. The thief is already gone, blending into the sea of faces. The success of pickpockets often relied on human nature. People didn't expect to be robbed in the middle of a cheerful fair. They were relaxed, distracted, maybe even a little drunk. The thieves counted on it. And when someone finally realized their loss, what could they do? Shout, "Stop thief!" into a crowd of hundreds? By then, the pickpocket was long gone, perhaps already spending the stolen coins on ale at a nearby tavern. There's another side to this story, though. For many pickpockets, crime wasn't about greed, it was about survival. London had its fair share of poor, desperate people who turned to theft simply to eat. A fair offered opportunity. Yes, it was risky, but it was also one of the few chances to snatch enough to last another week. In that sense, the fairs were not just about laughter and trade, but also about hunger and quiet desperation. Over time, pickpockets became such a nuisance that writers of the period began mentioning them in plays and ballads. They were part of everyday life, so common that everyone had a story. "My cousin lost his purse at Bartholomew Fair," or "Watch out, the cut purses are about." The word cut purse, by the way, was the classic medieval term. It wasn't just poetic, it was literally what they did. And it wasn't only commoners who fell victim. Even nobles could find themselves light a purse after a careless stroll through the fairgrounds. Imagine the embarrassment of a wealthy knight, armored and armed, realizing that some skinny youth had just outsmarted him with nothing more than a blade and a quick hand. It probably made for some very red faces and some very funny tavern gossip.
But for all their tricks, pickpockets rarely went down in history. Unlike the great knights, kings, or even the infamous bandits of the highways,
These small-time thieves lived and died in obscurity. Most were never caught, and those who were faced punishments that erased their names rather than preserved them. Yet their presence at the fairs was constant, woven into the very experience of medieval London life. So, as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself walking through one of those fairs. You hear the music, smell the roasting meat, feel the crush of the crowd. You pat your side, making sure your purse is still there. You smile, relaxed, taking in the sights. And somewhere behind you, unseen, a pair of hands is already reaching. The fairs of London were places of joy and celebration, but in the shadows, they were also places of quiet theft. A reminder that in every era, even one filled with knights and saints, someone was always ready to take advantage of a good distraction. If you've ever sat by a campfire or watched a candle flicker in the dark, you'll know that fire has a kind of magic about it. In the Middle Ages, though, fire wasn't just cozy, it was dangerous. Cities were built mostly of wood, roofs were thatched with straw, and water was carried by hand. One stray spark could turn an entire town into ash, and in some places, fire wasn't always an accident. Take Lübeck, for example. This bustling city on the Baltic coast was one of the crown jewels of the Hanseatic League, a trade network that made Northern Europe rich and lively. Lübeck's warehouses overflowed with salt, fish, cloth, and spices. Ships came and went from its harbor, bells rang in its churches, and merchants haggled in its squares. It was a place of prosperity, order, and occasional arson. Yes, arson. In a medieval city, setting fire wasn't just mischief, it was one of the worst crimes imaginable. And yet, for all the danger, some people still did it. Why would anyone risk burning down half of Lübeck? The reasons varied. Sometimes it was simple revenge. Maybe a merchant felt cheated in a deal. Maybe a servant was dismissed unfairly. Maybe neighbors couldn't stand each other and one decided a midnight fire would settle things. Other times it was more calculated. A rival city or trading house might quietly hire someone to spark a blaze, knowing it could cripple Lübeck's economy. In a world where trade was war, fire became a weapon. And then there were the strange, sad cases, people who simply seemed to enjoy it. Medieval records mention individuals accused of setting fires for no clear reason at all. Today, we'd call it pyromania. Back then, people called it madness, or worse, a pact with the devil. Either way, it was terrifying. Imagine the scene, a quiet night in Lübeck, the moon reflecting on the river, most of the city asleep. Then, faint at first, a smell of smoke, a flicker in the dark. Within minutes, flames leap from a roof. Neighbors shout, bells ring, buckets are filled, and chaos erupts. Men, women, and children scramble to save what they can, hauling water, dragging furniture into the streets. Horses rear, dogs bark, church bells toll like thunder, all from one hidden spark. And somewhere nearby, the arsonist slips into the shadows, watching their work spread. Lübeck, like other medieval cities, had strict laws against fire setting. Punishments were brutal. Executions were common, often by burning, as grim poetic justice. To the city fathers, arson wasn't just a crime against property, it was a crime against the whole community. It threatened lives, livelihoods, and the very stability of urban life. But here's the tricky part: proving someone was guilty. Fire destroys evidence. Accusations often came down to rumors. I saw him near the warehouse that night, or she had argued with the baker last week. Sometimes innocent people were blamed, especially outsiders or the poor. For the city, it was less about certainty and more about showing that justice, or at least order, had been restored. One thing that made Lübeck especially nervous was its wealth.
The Hanseatic League depended on safe warehouses, reliable ports, and trust between merchants. Fire threatened all of that. A blaze in one district could ripple across Europe if goods were lost. It wasn't just a local disaster. It could shake the whole trading world. That's why Lübeck took fire prevention seriously. Watchmen patrolled at night, bells were ready to sound alarms, and strict rules controlled where fires could be lit. Even so, accidents happened. A tipped candle, a chimney that wasn't cleaned, a cooking pot left too long on the fire. And when an accidental blaze looked suspicious, well, it was easy to imagine an arsonist lurking behind it. There's a strange irony here. In a city where fire was both necessary and feared, everyone lived with the knowledge that their world could change in an instant. Light a candle, cook your supper, warm your room, and hope that the flame behaved. Against that fragile backdrop, the deliberate act of arson felt like betrayal at the deepest level. Picture a merchant returning to Lübeck after weeks at sea. He expects to see the familiar skyline, church spires, warehouses, bustling streets. Instead, he finds blackened ruins, ash drifting on the wind, people huddled where homes once stood. For him, it wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was proof that one person's anger, or greed, or madness could scar an entire city. And yet, despite all this, people rebuilt. Fires came and went, arsonists were caught or escaped, but Lübeck endured. The city's stone churches rose again, its merchants filled their warehouses once more, and its ships sailed on. The memory of the flames lingered, though, whispered in warnings. Keep watch, keep safe, trust no one too much. For us, looking back, the arsonists of Lübeck remind us how fragile medieval life could be. Today, a fire might mean a call to the fire department. Back then, it meant neighbors with buckets, prayers to heaven, and the hope that the wind wouldn't shift. And if the fire was no accident, well, that was a crime that left scars far deeper than the ash. So, as you drift toward sleep, picture Lübeck by night. The cobbled streets are quiet, the harbor still, the city wrapped in silence. A candle flickers in a window, a lantern sways on a watchman's hip, and far away, a shadow moves carrying a spark. The city dreams in peace, not knowing that by morning, flames may chase the dawn. The arsonists of Lübeck are mostly forgotten now, their names lost to time, but in their day, they were among the most feared criminals of all, not because of what they stole, but because of what they destroyed. When we picture pirates, our minds often jump straight to the Caribbean. Parrots on shoulders, wooden legs, and barrels of rum. But before those stories, Europe had its own pirates, on rivers instead of seas. And one of the most famous waterways for such mischief was the Danube. The Danube, stretching across much of Central and Eastern Europe, was the lifeline of trade, culture, and communication. Boats carried salt, grain, wine, timber, and even people up and down its winding path. It was busy, profitable, and, if you were a criminal, an irresistible opportunity. Enter the river pirates.
And they used that knowledge to strike traders and travelers when they least expected it. Imagine this. A merchant barge, laden with barrels of wine, floats lazily down the Danube. The crew is relaxed, the sun is warm, maybe someone is even singing a little tune. Suddenly, from the reeds, a handful of boats rush forward. Men leap aboard, brandishing knives or clubs. In minutes, the cargo is seized, the crew tied up, and the pirates vanish as quickly as they appeared. By the time help arrives, all that's left is a shaken merchant and an empty hold. These pirates weren't just petty thieves. For some, it was a profession. They formed bands, working together to dominate stretches of the river. Some were poor men turned desperate. Others were minor nobles, falling on hard times, who realized that piracy could pay better than farming. A few even worked with corrupt officials, who quietly took a share of the profits in exchange for turning a blind eye. The Danube pirates were particularly feared in the Middle Ages because they attacked not just merchants, but also pilgrims and even soldiers. And unlike the colorful pirates of legend, there was little romance about them. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and often ruthless. Laws were harsh for captured pirates. Rulers wanted to protect the river at all costs, since trade was the bloodlife of their lands. Punishments included hanging, drowning, or being displayed as a warning to others. But as with many medieval criminals, the risk didn't stop the practice. The profits were too tempting, and the Danube too long and wild to police effectively. The pirates also thrived on geography. The Danube ran through forests, cliffs, and marshlands, perfect hiding spots. A pirate band could vanish into the wilderness after a raid, leaving little trace. Travelers spoke of certain stretches with dread, knowing they were likely ambush points. If you were lucky, you might bribe the pirates to let you pass. If you weren't, well, let's just say you probably didn't make it home to tell the tale. And yet, like so many medieval criminals, these pirates became part of local lore. Songs and stories exaggerated their exploits. Some were remembered almost like folk heroes, taking from the rich merchants and sharing, at least a little, with the poor villages along the banks. Others were cursed as devils in human form, the kind of figures mothers used to scare their children into behaving. Go to sleep, or the Danube pirates will get you. Not exactly a lullaby, but effective. There's also a quiet, ironic detail here. Some of the pirates eventually settled down and became boatmen, ferrymen, or traders themselves. A man who once attacked barges for a living might later earn his bread steering them safely through shallow waters. Perhaps they knew the risks too well, or perhaps they simply grew tired of always watching their backs. Either way, the line between pirate and honest worker was sometimes thinner than we'd think. Picture the Danube at twilight. The water glitters under the fading sun, birds call from the trees, and a barge drifts silently with the current. Somewhere on the bank, hidden in the reeds, eyes watch closely. A whispered signal passes between men crouched low in their boats. They wait for the right moment, oars poised, ready to push off. The river, calm and eternal, carries both honest travelers and lurking thieves. For the medieval world, the Danube pirates were a reminder of how fragile safety really was. Trade brought wealth, but also danger. A river that connected kingdoms could just as easily carry thieves from one shore to another. And for every merchant who grew rich from the flow of goods, there was a pirate planning how to take it all away. Today, their names are mostly forgotten, washed away by the centuries like footprints on a muddy riverbank. But in their time, they were feared enough to change how people traveled, traded, and even prayed. Before setting out, some merchants visited churches to ask for protection, hoping the saints could keep them safe from ambush. Others hired guards or traveled in convoys, strength in numbers against the lurking threat. So, as you sink deeper into rest, picture yourself drifting along the Danube. The water laps gently against the boat, the stars shimmer above, and the night is still. But in the shadows of the banks, there's always the chance of movement. Oars cutting silently through the water, figures crouched low, waiting. The river pirates of the Danube were not famous like Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, but they were very real, and to the people of medieval Europe, they were every bit as terrifying. When we think of medieval criminals, most of the names that come up are men, bandits, knights turned traders, pirates and thieves. But women too had their part in the darker corners of medieval life. The difference is that their stories rarely made it into the big chronicles. History, being mostly written by men, often brushed them aside. And yet they were there, clever, bold, and sometimes terrifying. Now, let's clear something up. We're not talking about witches. Witches, whether real or imagined, have already had plenty of attention, with bonfires and trials to spare. What we're looking at here are women who lived as outlaws, thieves, con artists, and even leaders of criminal bands. In their time, they were whispered about in taverns, feared in marketplaces, and cursed by sheriffs who couldn't catch them. One of the reasons women criminals were so unsettling to medieval society was that they broke not just the law, but also expectations. A woman was supposed to be obedient, quiet, and respectable. So when one picked up a dagger, ran a scam, or led a group of robbers, it shook the foundations of what people thought women could or should do. Take the female highway robbers. Yes, they existed. The roads of medieval Europe were dangerous, and women sometimes joined bands of thieves who ambushed travelers. Dressed in men's clothes, they could ride fast horses and wield weapons just like their male companions. Some even disguised themselves so well that victims never realized they were facing a woman. Only later, when a robber was caught and unmasked, would the shocked townsfolk murmur, "A woman?" Then there were the thieves in towns. Markets were bustling places, full of coins, goods, and distracted merchants. A skilled pickpocket, or cut-purse, could make a living slipping through the crowd. Some women worked in pairs. One would distract with chatter or a sudden argument, while the other dipped a hand into a pouch or basket. They targeted pilgrims, too, who were often exhausted and not paying much attention to their purses. Pilgrims carried offerings, food, or sometimes small valuables. Easy pickings for someone with nimble fingers. But women didn't just work alone. In a few cases, they actually led entire gangs. One name that surfaces in English records is Alice Kittler, although she's remembered mostly as an accused witch. Yet before that, she was infamous as a woman who supposedly poisoned husbands and built a criminal network around moneylending. Whether she was guilty or just unlucky, the fact remains, powerful women with shadows around them were often accused of crimes far beyond what could be proven.
Other women leaned into scams rather than violence. They pretended to be holy beggars, showing fake wounds or carrying false relics to earn pity and coins. Some claimed to be widows of noblemen, spinning sob stories until they were given shelter and money. It was fraud, medieval style, and often people fell for it. After all, it's harder to suspect someone who looks harmless or who seems too pitiful to deceive you. And then, of course, there were the darker figures, women who killed. Cases survive of wives poisoning their husbands, sometimes to escape abuse, sometimes to marry someone else, and sometimes just to take over property. Poison was considered a woman's weapon, sneaky and subtle, which made such crimes especially feared. A blade leaves a wound. Poison leaves whispers and paranoia. Suddenly, every meal, every cup of wine carried suspicion. Authorities didn't take lightly to women criminals. Punishments could be brutal. A man might be hanged for theft, but a woman might be burned, drowned, or mutilated. Part of this was legal, but part of it was symbolic. Society wanted to make an example of women who stepped outside the lines. In some towns, female thieves were shaved bald before execution, a way of stripping away both dignity and identity. But despite the harsh penalties, women continued to appear in the records as thieves, swindlers, and killers. Their very survival in the archives, even in fragments, shows how common they were. And perhaps that's the most surprising detail of all. Criminal women weren't rare. They were just erased or downplayed when the official histories were written. It's worth pausing to imagine the courage or desperation it took for these women to live this way. Medieval society offered few choices. A poor woman might work in fields, serve in households, or marry. But if none of those options promised survival, Crime became another path. It was dangerous, but sometimes it was the only way to put bread on the table. Picture a medieval street at dusk. Lanterns flicker, voices echo through the alleys, and merchants count their coins after a long day. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman walks with steady steps. Maybe she's carrying a basket of apples. Or maybe inside that basket is a stolen dagger or a pouch of coins taken from an unwary pilgrim. She blends in perfectly, invisible in plain sight. And that's what made her dangerous. For centuries, these women criminals were pushed into silence by history. Yet they remind us that crime was not just the domain of men. Women played their part, sometimes clever, sometimes violent, often underestimated. They may not have left behind grand legends like Robin Hood or Blackbeard, but in their own way, they bent the rules of their world and forced society to reckon with the fact that crime has never been one-sided. So, as you drift into rest, remember, not all medieval criminals wore armor or carried swords. Some wore plain dresses, shawls, or veils. Some smiled kindly as they lied. And some, unseen and unnamed, shaped the quiet fears of their time.